Okay. Welcome, everyone. I'm Sally Keller. I'm the Division Director of the Social and Decision Analytics Division, which is part of the Biocomplexity Institute at University of Virginia. And I want to welcome you to our first virtual Data Science for the Public Good forum speaker. As many of you know, the forum has been going on now for exactly a year. And each year we bring in a collection of distinguished speakers, as well as host a symposium, which will be August 7th this year. We have gone virtual like so many other organizations and meetings at this time, and we're quite excited about that. I just want to say it's the first time we've done this virtually, so if there are any glitches, we apologize. And if you have any questions or issues, please send a note on the chat, ask a question, but hopefully it'll go quite smoothly. Many of you are probably joining the forum for the first time because our forum has typically been located on site in our facility in Northern Virginia, in the Arlington, Virginia area, up on the 29th floor with the beautiful, beautiful vista looking out at the Capitol and the monuments. So we're just virtually simulating that for you today again. This forum is a partnership between the Biocomplexity Institute, my home institute, UVA's Darden School of Business, the School of Data Science, our new School of Data Science, and the Equity Center, which is a new partner with us this year. We want to thank many of our sponsors for their generous support, including Avison Young, the Washington Statistical Society, NORC at the University of Chicago, the American Statistical Association, our studio, Sage Publishing, and Westat. We appreciate this support, and we appreciate the continued support from these sponsors from last year to this year. Before we get into introducing our speaker, I have just one housekeeping item. We will take questions and answers at the end of the presentation. Everyone will be on mute. And if you have a question, go ahead and enter it in the Q&A little window that you should be able to find somewhere on your Zoom configuration. For me, it's at the bottom of my screen. And go ahead and enter your questions as you have them as we go along, and we will pull them together and moderate those to get Mark to answer those questions at the end of the session. Also, if you have, some thoughts and chats that you want to do, the chat window's open for everyone to participate in too. So let me introduce our speaker for today, for which we're really excited. It's Mark Hansen. And Mark, for nearly 3 decades, has worked at the intersection of data, art, and technology. And that, in my opinion, is 3 fabulous areas to be working in together. He holds appointments at Columbia University, including the David and Helen Gurley Brown Professor of Journalism and Innovation, and Director of the Brown and Helen Gurley Brown Institute of Media Innovation. Earlier in his career, Mark was a professor at UCLA, where he held positions in the Department of Statistics, the Department of Design, Media Arts, and the Department of Electrical Engineering. Mark has quite a robust practice that involves the presentation of data for the public, including exhibitions in New York, Madrid, Spain, London, and Paris. He has permanent displays in the lobbies at the New York Times building and the Public Theater in Manhattan. On the journalism side, Mark has been a long-standing visiting researcher at the New York Times R&D Lab, a late career intern at the Marshall Project, and a consultant with HBO Sports. Mark holds a BS in Applied Mathematics from the University of California, Davis, and a PhD and Master's in Statistics from the University of California, Berkeley. Today, he's going to talk to us about fascinating revelations. So Mark, I'll turn it over to you. Except you're muted.
Sorry about that. That's like the one rookie Zoom thing to start off with. If my dog decides to bark in the middle of this, I apologize in advance. She's otherwise a very good girl. Thank you for inviting me to speak. I'm very happy to do this, and happy to see so many people from people I know, some people from various places around the world. I think that's what's great about doing these things virtually. All right, so I'm gonna just share my screen and get on with the show. right. Oops. All right, so as Sally said, I'm currently appointed in the School of Journalism at Columbia. I've been there for 8 years now. Prior to that, I was at UCLA in a straight-up statistics appointment. In the 8 years that I've been with Columbia, I've taught mostly the computational classes, computational journalism classes. So I thought what I would do today is talk a little bit about what the role that computation has to play in journalism. It's an expanding role. It's an ill-defined but extremely exciting area, and one that I think has implications for how we might teach statistics. Because a lot of the language is the same, but the practices around it and the methods for coming to understand the world are very different. So, and if at any time you have any questions, I'm sort of keeping one eye on the chat. So if there's something that you don't understand, or please throw it into the chat. I'll keep an eye on that. All right. So when preparing to give one of the first talks I gave in the J School about computational journalism, I read a really nice piece in the Columbia Journalism Review by Philip Isle, who's this freelance journalist from Providence, Rhode Island. And the article was called Ode to Reporters' Notebooks. And for Isle, a reporter's notebook is more than that sort of paper and cardboard notebook that you see in this gentleman's hands. To Isle, it symbolizes the power and uniqueness of journalism as a profession. And as he put it, the reporter's notebook is, quote, a license to talk to interesting people and a ticket to interesting places. The reporter's notebook, in Isle's words still, is a low-tech device that he uses to capture the sights, smells, sounds, feelings, tastes, and other impressions of the world. And this is where I wanted to get this is, to me, distills a practice of journalism tidily. Isle puts it, to report is to be alert and alive in a particular time and place. To report is to be alert and alive in a particular time and place. That's a really beautiful way of describing how a journalist, the function of a journalist on a beat. And so my training is not in journalism, but statistics, as Sally mentioned. And when I arrived at the J School, I was told over and over that journalism is less an academic discipline than it is a habit of mind. And we cultivate in our students a curiosity about the world, a restless, questioning spirit that asks why things look the way they do. So my role as a statistician in the J School is to add computational lines of inquiry to this habit of mind. So if you take one thing from this presentation today, it's that the reporter's notebook represents a call, just as the reporter's notebook represents a call to be alert and alive in a particular time and place. For me in my teaching, computation extends that alertness and curiosity to the virtual world of data, code, and algorithms. So just as we equip a reporter to walk through the world assessing whether things seem fair or not, we can now give them through sort of computational journalism, through data journalism, we can give them an eye to ask questions, the same kinds of questions about data, code, and algorithm. So looking at data is not a new proposition for journalism. In fact, Pulitzer himself in 1904, in defining what would eventually become the school that I'm teaching at today, listed off what should be taught in the College of Journalism. There were things like history and law, things that are taught to our students still today. But one of the topics that he decided should be taught is statistics. And he puts it this way: everybody says that statistics should be taught, but how? Statistics are not simply figures. It's said that nothing lies like figures except facts. You want statistics to tell you the truth. You can find the truth there if you know how to get at it, and romance, human interest, humor, and fascinating revelations as well. What I find so amazing here is that Pulitzer is describing data as having a very strong narrative component. that there are stories to be found in data, stories to be told in data if we knew how to get at it. And this is 1904, so Gossett had just gotten to the brewery. I think Fisher was 11 or 12, something like that. So this view of data as having this heavy narrative content from Pulitzer, I think is quite interesting. At the journalism school, we've been trying to take that idea and bring it into a more contemporary setting where so much of the world around us has been digitized in one form or another, and hence is open to a computational practice. So we offer a STEM-coded MS degree in data journalism. We have a dual degree with computer science. So in 2 years, you get a master's in computer science and a master's in journalism. And we've authored some books about what the state of teaching data and computational journalism is in the United States. All these things are available from the Columbia Journalism website, and you can have a look and see sort of what typical syllabi look like and what some of the challenges are for teaching the subject. So as Sally mentioned, my role, in addition to being a professor at the J School, I lead an institute. The institute was founded 8 years ago by a generous gift from this woman, Helen Gurley Brown, who was the longtime editor of Cosmopolitan magazine. The gift was in honor of her husband, David Brown, who was a movie producer, producing Driving Miss Daisy and Jaws and other Few Good Men, movies of that sort, which means that for a long time, Steven Spielberg was on our board, which was a little ridiculous, but we kind of worked with it. So the institute that she funded is a mix of, or trying to get at, computation and journalism, in that it's bringing two institutions together, Columbia Journalism School and the other half at Stanford Engineering. So we are both engineers and technologists as well as journalists. And our goals in the work that we do at the Brown Institute is to imagine a new kind of journalism through technological or engineering advances, as well as to imagine new priorities and a new kind of research emphasis for engineering by tackling some of the questions that journalism brings up. And so what I thought I would do to give you a sense of what computational or data journalism looks like, I would give you a few examples of some of the things that we funded. The Institute, the gift that Helen Gurley Brown provided, created an endowment that gives off about $1 million a year that we give away in the form of grants and fellowships. So I thought I would go through a few of our projects and highlight what it is that they how they're addressing code and algorithm and data, and then eventually wind through some of the classwork that I've been doing and some of the work that I've been doing at the J School. And hopefully you'll start to see how this connects to a data science practice. So one of the projects that we funded a year before last was something called Democracy Fighters. It starts with the observation that since 2000, over 111 journalists have been killed in Mexico. Most of these crimes are unsolved, and actually this count of 111 journalists makes Mexico one of the most dangerous countries in the area to be a journalist. And what the woman who proposed this project noticed, Alejandra Ibarra, what she noticed was that when a journalist is killed, and this is an example of Ricardo Cabrera, who founded something called El Politico. When he was, this is what his site looked like prior to his murder. After his murder, the site sort of looks like this. The legacy of his work starts to disappear over time. The credit card or whatever that was paying for the domain name service disappears. So the domain goes away, all the links on social media go away, the articles go away. It becomes hard to understand what this gentleman, or what this journalist was publishing on, and the conditions under which he was publishing at the time he was killed. And so Alejandra's project was an attempt to collect all of the journalism that was happening, that particular journalist, or the 111 that had been killed in Mexico, that they were working on to kind of preserve their legacy. This creation of a database where nobody is really incentivized to make that database is a fundamental act of data journalism. And so in this case, there's also an interface that goes along with it. Not all of the journalists who have been killed in Mexico were reporting on crime or the drug cartel or government corruption or something. Sometimes it might be a culture reporter who takes the wrong picture at the wrong time. We had an opening for the piece in Mexico City. Some of the family members of journalists who had been killed showed up, and around the room we distributed a printout, if you will, of the database. Thousands and thousands of pages of printed news articles that had been authored by the journalists who had been killed. And it ended up with a lot of secondary news coverage. This is Alejandra. So this is the kind of project that for us at the Brown Institute is kind of in our sweet spot, in the sense that Helen Gurley Brown really didn't care about Columbia and Stanford or any of the engineering school or the journalism school. She cared about people and helping support people through their projects. And then it fits in with our larger technology mission in that it is applying sort of database technology in this case, and a really sweet interface design to help people understand what was going on at the time of what's going on in Mexico. In another sort of database situation, and these examples I'm thinking now are a little heavier than maybe we should have done on a Thursday afternoon. But another example is a project called When Deportation is a Death Sentence. This is an example of, again, journalists recognizing that there is a gap in the data record. So this project is about people who flee their home country, fleeing some dangerous situation. They arrive in the United States, they apply for asylum, but they're sent back home. Nobody's keeping track of what happens when these people are sent back home. The US government is not incentivized to keep track because that doesn't tell a very kind tale. And their family and friends that they're returned to also don't want to speak out because they're still living in these dangerous conditions. So there isn't really a database to understand what the impacts are of Trump or even Obama era deportation policies. And so we funded a group to go out and to start collecting data, heavy reporting in the field, talking to people, collecting data around situations, individuals who had gone through this asylum process. We've also been having a response around COVID-19, again, filling gaps. One of the grantees we had this year has started making very targeted Freedom of Information Act requests for documents concerning, or basically for emails from state and local health departments and governments to see who is making decisions about COVID-19 and about critical city and state functions. This work has ended up published in several articles in the New York Times, like this first one, which was about the decision process that was made around Mardi Gras. You see in this case one part of the New Orleans government preparing for Mardi Gras and another part preparing for the pandemic, and the two really aren't talking. And in part, they're not talking because they don't have adequate guidance from the federal government. Another set of articles about Florida beaches and when they closed and the decision process about that. So what's being analyzed here are a series of emails and email threads that were circulating amongst the health departments and the important sort of parts of the government responsible for keeping beaches open and closed, what kind of communication happened, who was saying what when, what was known, what wasn't, where were we in the pandemic. Basically, this kind of gap filling in this case is trying to present or fill in a public record of how decisions were made, because as we move from data stories that are about the numbers, how many people tested, how many people have the virus, how many people have died, and so on, we're going to transition to stories about impact, recovery, and accountability. And this is an example of those accountability stories. On the more number side, and maybe more recognizable as data, one of the early websites tracking or making a case for collecting testing data, not just the numbers of people who are found who've been infected, but like how many tests were performed and so on. That whole project was spun up by Alexis Madrigal and his colleagues at The Atlantic. Again, journalists working to try to fill gaps when the official data record isn't there. They were also starting to report on racial inequalities around the impacts of or disparities around the impacts of the virus. Again, collecting that data, forcing municipalities to release that data, and so on. And sometimes it's grubby work. They collect, if you go to covidtracking.com and have a look at their data, they're basically doing huge web scraping every day. Sometimes it's ugly. Connecticut puts its numbers out in a PDF. Why do people keep putting numbers out in PDFs? But anyway, so that's maybe more of a traditional data journalism function. I'm going to give you just a couple more examples so you get a sense of the complexity that might be at play. This is an article from BuzzFeed a couple years ago called Spies in the Skies, and it was basically looking at flight patterns of first of flight aircraft that were known to be run by the DHS or the FBI. There are amateur networks of flight or transponder data collectors that share that data and allow you to build up stable flight paths for any aircraft. And so the project started by finding aircraft that were run by the DHS or the FBI, and found these sort of circling patterns. And these circling patterns are indicating that the plane is just circling around, observing, right? There's presumably some sort of target of interest in a particular in this particular area, and so the plane is circling round and round. So they started there, and then they went back through and said, all right, we have these basic patterns. Can we maybe train a simple machine learning algorithm to find other planes that have these patterns, and see if we might be able to find other planes that are being operated by DHS or the FBI because of the patterns that they're suggesting. Again, sometimes this turns up planes that they did with tail numbers that they didn't know were DHS planes. Sometimes it turns up planes that are training and helping new pilots. You know, they're spending so many hours in their training time just simply going in circles, and that's maybe where the reporting comes in. This is a beautiful piece from 538 using Word2Vec, but applying it in something they were calling Community2Vec. to look at different parts of Reddit that had to do with Donald Trump, and decomposing those or creating embedding around those. And what was interesting is that you have the kind of standard word-to-vec arithmetic, but then they started to apply it. Again, it's applied to different parts of Reddit. And as the article goes on, they slowly describe what word2vec is doing, or what the embeddings are doing. And it's attempting to weave the methodology that's being used to analyze the data into the larger narrative, so that people come away not only understanding a little bit more about Reddit, but also understanding something about the methodology that was being used to come to that understanding. There is something in the chat about the ethics of web scraping, and there are definitely a lot of ethics around web scraping that we can talk about afterwards. And then just an example from USA Today, which was looking at text as data for data journalism, new laws that are being, identifying parts of laws that were largely being incorporated from other sources. And then you have entire websites or publications devoted to doing a kind of accountability journalism, but for data, code, and algorithms. So the markup is a great example of that. They even go so far as to have an ethics policy that includes data ethics and what they're going to follow when they produce original research. And I think that's one thing that, one point that I want to make is that data journalism is not just about maybe, it is some spreadsheet work. There are lots of data journalists who work in spreadsheets and so on, but it's also advanced R programming. It's also machine learning. There are a lot of different fairly complicated methods being used that you might not expect to have journalists using themselves. You might expect them maybe to find an article about some kind of text processing first, and then interview the expert, or maybe have them make some graphs for them. But in this case, or in many cases, data journalists are starting to do it for themselves. They're using some of the same tools that we use, some of the same mechanisms that we use, and sorry, I should plug in my laptop. Some of the same mechanisms that we use, and are creating original knowledge on their own. There are entire conferences devoted to CARs, computer-assisted reporting. That's a fairly old term, but back when data journalism was largely about surveys. But the CAR conference, or NICAR conference, is something, if you were at all interested in data journalism, it's worth going to. You will find yourself among a group of hardworking, geeked out journalists who will sit for half a day with an introduction to R, or to level up the Python game. They're using the same tools that we're using, and using them to great effect, simply applying them in that way that Philip Isle described, to be alert and alive in a particular time and place. All right, so I'm gonna transition from that as data journalism. And there's a lively discussion going on about pulling data from PDFs on the chat. So if you want to know something about PDF Miner perhaps, or some of these tools, there's a lovely conversation going on. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we for the care and feeding of young data journalists. So for the last 3 years, have been teaching a class, Tech, Media, and Democracy. It's actually a class, we call it an all-city class. That's probably a little extreme. It involves 6 universities across New York City. So it's Cornell Tech and Columbia Journalism and NYU, Pratt, the New School, Parsons. So we have designers and engineers and data scientists and journalists all working together on questions of tech, media, and democracy. And so the very first year I taught this class, the topic this tech media democracy is a yawning chasm of a topic. And so we boiled it down to something that we called computational propaganda. And we tried to understand what, what the shenanigans that happened around the 2016 election, let's explain those to reporters so that we can report on them better. And so we covered things like trending topics, how might one define the word trending, what does trending mean, what are the role of influencers, what are bots all about. They learned some basic Unix because we need to give them the keys to the kingdom, how to work with the cloud, or cloud-based services, recommender system search, some basic web scraping and APIs. And again, for whatever reason, web scraping seems to be a thing that journalists have to do on a regular basis. Because I think also lots of government organizations find it easier to publish data in forms that, well, anyway, we don't have to go there. And then some basic machine learning and AI. So where everything's done in a Jupyter notebook, my guess is that lots of your classes, if you find yourself at a university, are also done in the Jupyter notebook. We teach them Python in this class because it's the only class they're going to be taking where they're getting any computation. If they only get one computational one language, I feel like it should be Python. That's going to help them most. So we have some basics about this is a data frame, or we have this is how the web works, because if we don't know how the web works, we can't execute scraping in an intelligent way, and we also don't know where to start. We can't be alert and alive in a web-based world if we don't understand the ways in which bits are being shuttled around the internet. We work on machine learning and teach students how to think through learning processes and the questions to ask about the outcomes of machine learning. We do a little work with APIs, and in particular Twitter's API, this year or year before looking at hashtags. And this year around the coronavirus, the class decided that as a group that if we didn't do something in this moment, if we didn't help somehow, we would look back on this time and feel like, just not feel right about it. So we volunteered our services to the Detroit Free Press and did more web scraping than I care to admit to, but it's apparently saved hours of a reporter's work, which means that reporter can now go off and do other things rather than scraping or tediously pulling information from the Michigan government website about the pandemic. Sometimes it's about pulling things out of an image-based PDF or an image-based, and the argument that the Michigan government here gave is that we have to put this table out as an image because we're using Medium as our publishing platform, so we have to put it. Oh, it's the worst excuse possible. But anyway, a little optical character recognition, a little tesseract, and away we go. And anyway, one of the last topics we cover is on bots. And we talk about bots in a great deal of detail. And so I thought what I would do is spend a little time and give you a sense of how data journalism class approaches the concept of bots, which has a lot of computation, in it, and a lot of data work in it, and certainly a lot to do from a data science perspective. But then where you follow that story, or the fact that you even think about it as a story, is what might differentiate data science from data journalism. So let's just talk about bots for a second. There are some bots that notify. So this is a bot that tweets every time there is a new word, a word that's never appeared in the New York Times before. It'll tweet that word out, like procrastinator, baker. And then we all probably know the San Francisco Quake Bot, which every time there's an earthquake in the Bay Area reports it. It's just taking data from USGS. The Marshall Project has a steady feed of tweets under the account The Next to Die, where they're routinely mining data from the states that have a death penalty, and look for the next person on death row to be executed. There are also bots that inform. This is for you, John. This is Every Tract, which is slowly tweeting out every census tract in the United States. I have a question. Does mainstream journalism use data science in their research and decision making? Sounds like a lot of training in data mining and processing for journalist writers. So there's actually two sides to it. I'll take a moment here just so that you can look at these lovely tracks. Machine learning is finding its way both into the business side as well as the editorial side. Journalistic organizations often split themselves into church and state. So there's a side that makes money and there's a side that does the reporting. I've been describing training journalists to think through how to extend their reporting through computation, but we can also extend how information is delivered, optimize how information is delivered through recommendation engines, through smarter paywalls, through a whole range of what are called news products, many of which depend on sort of data science or machine learning for their action. So there are bots that notify, there are bots that inform, and then there are bots that amplify. So this is actually an account that started everything off for us. This is John Leguizamano. He has something over 700,000 followers, and one of the students was sort of looking, I don't know how exactly they ended up on his page, but we noticed that this tweet, "I'm good, you," I mean, that's literally all he wrote, managed to earn it 4 retweets and 34 likes. Now, he's a very famous guy. Okay, so there's going to be someone who's going to like this no matter what, but still, it just seemed like a high number. So we wanted to know who are these people who are retweeting for that matter, this content. So here's one of the accounts that's retweeting his content. It's CP Alarcon. This has they've only tweeted 5 times. They joined in April 2010, but they've liked 49,000 things, which seems like a lot of activity for someone. But that was 2010, so maybe this is a person. They don't really show themselves, and they haven't really done much to tidy up their Twitter space, so maybe not. Here's another person who retweeted that tweet. This is Kim Hill. She's Kim Hill 4608662, which seems a little suspicious because I'm not quite sure. It's not a date. It's not a, maybe that's it. I have no idea what that number might be. The other suspicious piece is that this was done in the early 2018. We pulled this page from early 2018 when we first noticed it, and they joined in May of 2016. And in that short period of time, they had managed to generate 85,000 likes, which I think we determined was liking something 9 times every hour for every hour of the day for every day of the year, which is a lot of activity and probably wouldn't give her much time to pose in front of Niagara Falls. I'm assuming that's Niagara Falls. And then we get people like this. This is Marquise Martinez. Doesn't have many tweets, doesn't have many followers, seems like a nice enough guy. Everything is rolling along smoothly until you read that this is the dean of the Harvard Medical School, which doesn't seem exactly right. And in fact, if you go and look at something called the Botometer, which is another exercise in machine learning, where they take a series of input variables about a particular account. Some are declared to be bots and some are not, and they train a machine learning algorithm to decide if you're a bot or not. And this particular account is very botty. The redder it is, the more bot-like it is. And so you see various things, lots of retweeting, and it gives you sort of a set of reasons why they're making their decisions. So there's a little bit of explanation going on here. If you also do a reverse image search on this picture, you'll find that they have an Instagram account. under the name of Gabriel, Facebook account under the name Sam. They are Arthur on Twitter and MySpace and PQ. And they're also Sam, yeah, this is the Sam on Twitter. Oh, sorry, there's another, it's a different last name. So this poor person's picture has clearly been attacked and is being used in a variety of ways. Then there are other situations, though, that are a little bit more befuddling and sort of describe the arms race that we're used to in a lot of situations when we're talking about fraud. So this is an account called Tokes. It came to our attention because we were looking at the hashtag crisis actors, which started circulating after the Parkland shooting because there was a belief, or there was a rumor circulating, piece of fake news circulating that the students who were giving firsthand accounts of the shooting were in fact actors. And this account was one of the first to tweet out an article from the Gateway Pundit, which is sort of known for this kind of story, about the crisis actors. But if you look into this, right, that for the same amount of time, basically, that Hill, the previous account that we saw, has been online, this person's tweeted 83,000 times and 61,000 likes. So it's a huge amount of activity. But the bottom meter says that this person's likely to be human. And I think in part because this person goes to sleep at night and this person tweets less on the weekends than the weekdays, which is 2 lines of code in a Python program, and you suddenly look a little bit more like a human. Anyway, so bot or not is a difficult kind of sloppy business. Anyway, we weren't worried about bots. What we really wanted to know was John Leguizamano managed to get all these people to follow him. We want people to follow us. This is my class. And we wanted to have more influence. So we literally Googled, how do you get more followers on Twitter? We were recommended this website called Devumi. It was the first one that came up. It seemed well ranked. It described this beautiful process, like this is what was happening to us without Devumi. You know, we simply weren't growing at all, but gosh, what could happen if, and so how do we do it? Sign us up. And signing up was easy. You just chose a plan, you paid, and then you waited. And we did that, although we didn't have the beach chairs, but the followers came, and the followers looked kind of amazing. These are the kinds of accounts that we were getting. So Jessica Eldridge, Team Spoiler, Megan Kind, pictures, every one of them had a picture. They weren't like the egg. Every picture also had a background that often had other pictures of people in them, and the people matched, or in the descriptions there was often a reference to a Facebook page or an Instagram page, and all the pictures kind of matched up. So everything was kind of pointing to these people being real, which didn't make any sense because we bought 2,500 followers and we basically paid a few pennies for each one. So why on earth would this person follow us for a few pennies? Like there can't be that much of a business in it. And it took us an embarrassingly long time to realize that what had happened was these are our people below, and there were actually other accounts on Twitter, the people above. So Jessica Eldridge is at Giraffe Pink, Giraffe Pink, and the follower we had was at GLRAFFE Pink. So a lowercase I become a lowercase l, O's become zeros, underscores become double underscores. Basically, the bot maker here had stolen someone's identity, made a small change to a place that the user interface doesn't make particularly obvious, made a small change to their name, and away they go, and they start tweeting the content of the people who paid, like us. We paid for followers, and that became a little bit troubling when you started to see that some of these accounts were owned by minors. The people who were looking for to buy popularity like this are celebrities, but they're also, turns out, hardcore pornographers. So we had several situations where minors were retweeting hardcore porn, not okay. So at that point, we started keeping track of all of our, we made a list of our 4,600 or so, our 2,500 followers. And then we started to spider the network. So we said, all right, who else do these people follow? And we saw that, for example, a CNN commentator had 2,400 of our 2,500 followers. And we thought, Hilary Rosen is her name. And we thought, gosh, what are the chances that Hilary Rosen had 2,400 of our 2,500 followers and all of ours were bots? Why would they all be following her? And does it seem like that's a little fishy to me? And it certainly seems a little fishy. So we spidered the network up and down, looking at who our bots followed, and then in turn who followed them, and basically filling out a list until we had something like 56,000 of these accounts, which didn't seem huge given the size of Twitter, but it was certainly enough for us to go to the New York Times and say, "Dear Gabe," this was the deputy investigator, or the investigations editor of the Times, and we're like, look, we've been doing this. We've been finding some of these things. We've been finding basically identity theft. What do you think? And after about a year of computation, this appeared on a Sunday, front page above the fold, which isn't too shabby, buying online influence from a shadowy market, where we basically turned this into a full-fledged story. Online, it's a much better experience. It's something called the Follower Factory. You should have a look. And let me describe to you what we found. So this is Chef Simon. He's one of the Iron Chefs. He's also on ABC, was a co-host of ABC's The Chew, and he had something like nearly 1 million followers. If you look at his followers, though, that's too complicated picture. This one's easier. If you look at his followers, it'll take a second to describe this graph. So on the x-axis, we have the order in which someone followed Chef Simon. So the very first dot on the left, all the way over to the left, would be the very first follower that Chef Simon ever had. And then the y-axis is when that person joined Twitter. Okay, so x-axis is the order in which they're following the chef, and the y-axis is when they join Twitter. And you expect that with organic growth, that this kind of curve would happen, an increasing curve, because people are joining later and later and later as time goes on, and some number of them are going to follow the chef because they're fans of the show, and so you expect to see that kind of increase. If you look a little farther, though, past this, we had compressed basically this area. If you look past it, you start to find these stripes coming up in there in his follower list. And what these stripes represent are periods of time, stretches of time where most of the followers, they're all coming in at the same time. They're all following him at the same time, but they were also joining Twitter at about the same time. And that happens a lot with bot makers who will get a huge tranche of stolen emails and then create a bunch of accounts all at one time and then let them sit or age or whatever and then deploy them. And so here what you're seeing is bots joining and following Chef Simon. I think in the end he bought something on the order of 500,000 followers or something, which is insane. This is Hilary Rosen, the CNN commentator I told you before. When she was called on it, she said, yeah, I was experimenting, seeing how I could up my social media presence. She was kind of blasé about it. This is Martha Lane Fox. She also apparently bought a lot of followers. The embarrassing thing about her is that she's a Twitter board member. She basically threw an assistant under the bus and said some eager assistant bought her followers to make her look better, but I don't know. The story actually, it's worth giving a read because our students thought that we could just go walk down to Varick Street. This is an office on Varick Street where the company Devumi was supposed to be housed. Instead, they were housed in Palm Beach. There's just a whole lot of things about kind of a bait and switch with this company and who's real and who's not and what's there and what isn't. It's quite a nice story actually, with a strong data and computational line through it. In the end, this inauthentic activity is something that you can just go to a place like Black Hat World and find a provider like Peeker that will, you can select people to follow you on Twitter or Instagram views or Instagram likes or followers, maybe some Pinterest activity, you name it, you can buy it. So there were some things that came from the story, and that's one of the things that comes from data journalism because it gets published and that publication has actions. One of the things is that we showed up early on Hacker News, which basically said, gosh, you know, Twitter has all these engineers who are really high priced and talented, and this, you know, sort of random group from the New York Times was able to do this. Why couldn't Twitter do this? Which I took as a little bit of an insult because the point of this was to teach our students how to do something like this. But anyway, it is what it is. Some people got embarrassed. Paul Hollywood, who was the Great British Bake Off, bought a bunch of, like, a ton of followers. I should mention that one of the ex-employees of the company gave us the customer records after we'd done all this work so that we could say that this person actually purchased the fake followers and not just make an inference that this seems suspicious. The lesson there being that you should always treat your employees well, because a disgruntled employee, like in this case, apparently the employees of the company weren't given laptops. They were forced to use their own laptops, which means they had the company database on their own laptop, which means that when they broke with the company, they had the company's records with them. Anyway, not good. So Paul Hollywood, we said, hey, let's talk about followers. Seems like you bought some. And he said, I don't know what you're talking about. Let's talk tomorrow. And then in the intervening 20 some odd hours, he deleted his Twitter account, created a new one and said, and then basically said to us, I don't know what you're talking about. Richard Roper, who's a critic for the Chicago Sun-Times, his defense basically was, well, I thought I was buying real followers, which I don't think that's any better, but anyway. The New York Attorney General opened up an investigation and eventually put the company out of business. Lots and lots of accounts disappeared literally the next day after this appeared, which means they had to know something about it. And then eventually there was a huge purge of tens of millions of accounts that Twitter quoted our investigation as being the cause for. California also now has a law restricting the use of bots for election purposes as well as commerce to try to head off the spread of misinformation through bot campaigns. And this also sort of tells you the difficulty in trying to make legislation around some of this. This particular law is about electioneering and about commerce, like selling things, but it doesn't, for example, cover misinformation around the census or around any other sort of democratic function that requires people's participation. So this legislation and policy piece around tech is hard. And then the last thing is that we were part of a package. This article was part of a package that the New York Times submitted and was named a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. So to finish, let me just tell you about a couple of other kinds of data projects and then I'll close. I had done some work at the Marshall Project looking at predictive policing. We were working closely with a company that offered predictive policing software. Basically, think about trying to predict what crime will occur with a random forest. And we got to pick apart all of that, recreating maps, and eventually having a ride along with the police officers who were using this software that is attempting to predict where crime is supposed to occur. Yeah, a bit like Minority Report, but not nearly as, well, there's no Tom Cruise. But anyway, and then we did a little work on the census. Probably a little too early, but some work on the census. The Bureau had launched a reconstruction attack on the census itself, and we thought this would be interesting to see if we could do this. Following material that the Bureau published about their own attack, we were able to reconstruct it and then use that data for other things. You know, the interesting thing here is that you want to publish stuff. So we wanted to publish, you know, if the Bureau is going to start publishing data in differential privacy form, then, or using differential privacy rules, then can we start to help explain that to the general public? Every time there's a data release, we've been trying to keep on top of the software that's been released, and can we do something with it, and what would add to the public conversation about the census. This was a release from 1940. I'm gonna try to leave some time for questions, so I'm not gonna go through this. But our work with the census, I should also say, because it's not just data science, there's also a heavy journalism component. The Knight Foundation had funded us to basically do a study of census reporting and what census reporters need, which had us taking a trip across the country, which is something I'd never done before, most of it by train, visiting places and convening large rooms of journalists and social scientists and data scientists and sometimes community members and activists to talk about the census and what's needed to help get out the count. That was Albuquerque. This is a little out of order. This is Michigan. Oops. We spent some time in Detroit, Chicago. We then ended in, we went to Southwest Kansas. This is Dodge City, Kansas. Again, most of this was by train. This is us getting out of Dodge. Dodge City was interesting from a census perspective because there are 53 languages spoken. Most of the people are, there's a huge immigrant community working in these meat processing facilities. It's just a very challenging area to try to think about counting. We went to Window Rock and the Navajo reservation to talk to the Navajo Times about the kind of journalism that was done. Not so much journalism getting ready for the count at the time. This was in January. A lot of that has changed since. They did give us an interesting statistic that the reporting from 2010, one of the best performing articles they did about the census, actually one of the best performing articles of the year, had to do with the fact that according to the census that year, the Navajo Nation outnumbered the Cherokee. So, so we from there took a flight and finished our trip in Los Angeles at USC, where our collaborator lives. We also spent some time looking at just what local census reporting looks like and taking a data analytic approach to that, both doing data analysis of the particular news stories from different places about what kinds of topics are being talked about, but then also looking at sort of federal spending, and then we did a series of dives into local legislation. So can you find places where in laws there are references made to the census that are tagged to the the most recent census that would affect whether you got a court or not, or how much money you get from the local government, or any other kind of regulation that depended on population. And so we have some machine learning algorithms that go through and skim through that sort of thing, which eventually allows us to assess the impact of, let's say, a 5% undercount or something like that. All right, so I'm going to stop and take some questions. And my parting thoughts to you are what's here on this slide. Just that data and data technologies have new social relevance, and that data themselves are something to be open to question. They involve human attention, innovation, and memory, and are subjective in the same way, or inherit the subjectivities of the people who have collected them. The stories they tell about who we are and how we live are often incomplete, open-ended, and biased. data and the networks they circulate across can reinforce or challenge systems of power, and that as truth tellers, sense makers, and explainers of last resort, journalists need to be able to understand how data, code, and algorithm works in society. So finally, I would say that these acts of data journalism are also contributing substantially to data literacy, that we're helping people understand a little bit more about the role of data in how our world works, in the same way that places like the New York Times have helped improve the visual literacy through high-end graphics. All right, so I will stop there and say thank you and take any questions.
So Mark, there was a little bit of discussion in the chat around ethics, and then again in the questions, we have a couple questions about ethics and equity. So ethical concerns of the web scraping and authenticity of the data sources, and not unrelated to that are equity issues, in things like the policing work or similar projects, which can have data biases in the models that are created.
Absolutely. So from a practical perspective, the scraping work, when I used to teach at UCLA in the stat department, I didn't think twice about web scraping assignment. Now that I'm in a journalism program, you think twice. You look at terms of use, you decide, am I going to break terms of use or am I not? What we teach our students is that there will be an editor with them, and you and that editor need to decide if the public interest is served by breaking a particular term of use. If it's not, then don't do the project. But you're usually not making these decisions on your own. I also have my students include their email address in the header, the from field of the HTTP headers that they're sending, so that if someone wants them to stop, they know how to get in touch with them. Now the issues around policing and that sort of thing, that's exactly what journalism is supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be deciding, is this piece of technology ethical or not? Is this piece of technology fair? Who's winning and who's losing, right? There's a very strong narrative that says that if it's data related and there's some sort of machine learning or AI involved, then it must be objective. And I would tell you that there's a great deal of journalism now, or algorithmic accountability is the term that it goes under, a large component of data journalism or computational journalism that is simply about deciding whether or not these systems are fair.
So Mark, there's a couple queries about, how can somebody volunteer and get started doing some of the things you've talked about today? And also, is there a version of your tech media and democracy course that's more open to the public?
Right. So all of our lessons are available online, and I can send around. They're on GitHub. Computational Journalism 2020, I think is the. So the past 3 or 4 years worth of lessons are there, and the data to feed them. Now, in terms of getting involved, lots of newsrooms are hiring data journalists. I would warn you, though, that it is not a lucrative profession. Journalism is going through a very difficult moment, and our dual degree with computer science students, for example, they have a legitimate choice between a tech firm and a journalism firm, and they really have to want to work toward the public good to take on a journalism career. That said, there are models where people can work with newsrooms. Newsrooms, I imagine that if you walked into your local paper and said, "Hello, I am a statistician. I'm interested in helping out. Are there data questions you need help with, or whatever?" My guess is an editor would jump on it. It will take some time for you to understand. My first experience was at the Marshall Project, and it takes time because you are under an editor and you are not necessarily completely autonomous. You are following the path of a story, but it is a really exciting it is an exciting use of our skills, and it is a humbling, for me anyway, it was a humbling realization that I am completely unprepared for certain kinds of data-related methodologies. So I can fit all the models I want, but my work often just stopped there. Data journalism rarely stops there. Next stop is go interview someone, go talk to someone about what you found. What's next? What does this mean? What are the implications of this? And that degree of interviewing, of talking to people, of pulling a narrative line out like we referred to at the beginning with Pulitzer, that narrative structure is something we don't do very well in data science. We often think of communication as simply good PowerPoint or explaining our work well or making it reproducible to other people who are in the know. But the idea of using our tools to learn something about the community around us and help us in some way, that is a slightly different, that's an elaboration, and I think of the mission, and I think it depends on the school you go to about how seriously that's taken.
Well, Mark, I want to thank you, and that's such a perfect note to end the talk on and the session on, because we have just launched this week our Data Science for the Public Good Young Scholars program, summer program. It's a virtual program this summer, and what you just described in terms of getting young scholars across all fields of study interested in both data science and working hand in hand with some of their local communities and on public good endpoint problems is the spirit of what they're trying to do. So I'm hoping they're inspired today. And I also want to, I should say, the program this summer, we've helped launch programs at Iowa State, Virginia State, Virginia Tech, and Oregon State University, and we have 64 students and 30 projects going on simultaneously, virtually across these schools and cross collaboration between the schools. So it's very exciting. And we will be having our Data Science for the Public Good Symposium on August 7th. Our keynote speaker is Ken Pruitt, one of our former census directors. And you'll have an opportunity to see the results of all of these students and project teams, which include postdocs and faculty, see the fruits of their work from the summer at the symposium, which will be virtual.
You know, Sally, if I might add just one small thing. One thing that journalists are trained to do that we don't train our data scientists to do, or at least I haven't trained my statisticians, or I didn't train my statisticians to do, there's a degree of agency that comes with data journalism where you feel like you have the capacity and the authority to look around directly around you to see where your skills might help, and you can be the originator of these ideas. There's not necessarily an implied client. It's something that you do on your own. You apply your methods and you stop and see how you might be useful and what's going on here, and does this situation seem right or not. And that to me is like an important differentiator that I would love to see, you know, brought into some project work and things like that. Yeah.
Well, thank you. That's really great advice. And for everyone who's joined us today, we will be posting Mark's talk in a few days. And so please go back and re-review it. There are many questions on some of the materials on the slides, and you might be able to get more information there and share it with your friends. And we hope to see all of you back here in August.
Thank you again, Sally.